We have two responses. Can I ask Sarah Smith from Bristol University?
Right, okay, so I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to make the response. I should declare my interest. So I'm an applied microeconomist with some research experience in individual donations and charitable giving, but very little experience in the internet or expertise in kind of specifically online giving. So I really would like to thank Lucy for her excellent paper, Disrupting Philanthropy, which was an excellent survey of the current state of knowledge in this area. So without a kind of detailed expert background, my approach to this has been to sort of step back and to ask some sort of very basic questions. So I'll have to apologise if I'm kind of telling you things that you already know, but I think it's important to ask the very basic questions. I think trying to answer these very basic questions is going to be key to understanding how the internet may shape giving. So while Lucy's talk focused quite broadly on sort of philanthropy and the activities of their organisations, I've defined philanthropy quite narrowly, and I'm mainly going to be talking about giving and kind of individual donations. So as I said, I'm going to ask some sort of very basic questions and kind of within the context of these questions, talk a little bit about what we might think the future is going to hold. So these are the questions. So the first is, how is the internet going to affect giving? So this is kind of the big question that we'd like to address. But what I mean by this is, what are the sort of distinctive features of the internet that might bring about changes in giving? Then the second question is, what is going to change? Are we going to see changes in who gives, how much they give, or are we going to see changes in who people give to? The third question is, how are these outcomes going to change? What are the mechanisms through which the internet is going to cause changes in these sort of key kind of outcomes? And then finally, I'm going to sort of say a little bit about what we need to know. I think in this area, it seems as though there's quite a lack of a lot of sort of hard evidence. So there are some challenges. But as Lucy has suggested, the internet provides quite a lot of opportunities for doing further research on giving. Right. Okay. So this is really sort of Internet 101. So it's kind of trying to think about what is distinctive about the internet and how these kind of distinctive features might impact on giving. So I've kind of highlighted sort of two things about the internet that might give rise to changes in philanthropy. So first of all, as we've heard, the internet sort of fundamentally lowers the cost of acquiring and sharing information. And so if we think about people making decisions about giving, we've heard about how individual donors can kind of more easily search for the best organisation. Right, so what do I mean by the best organisation? So I think there are kind of two ways in which donors might use the internet to search for the best organisation. So we've heard quite a lot about how the internet can be used to provide individual donors with more feedback on the outcomes of the organisations. And so we might think that donors want to find the best performer in terms of the most effective organisation that's going to deliver the outcomes that they're interested in. I think a sort of second definition of the best organisation is the kind of the best fit. So we think about not-for-profits as being mission-oriented organisations. They're not just delivering specific outcomes, but they're also concerned with how those outcomes are delivered. And also those outcomes themselves may well be defined in terms of sort of different missions. So it's not just the most effective in terms of delivering an outcome, but it's also the organisation that best fits with the donor's own mission. And I think the internet is going to, may well change how donors search for those best organisations and the ability of donors to find the best organisation to which to give. So that's kind of the first way the internet might affect giving. The second is that it provides new opportunities for interaction. And Lucy's spoken much more colourfully and expertly than I possibly could about this. But clearly donors can network with other donors, and also fundraisers can find new ways to interact with donors, both informing them about how their money is being spent and also finding new ways to raise money from donors. So both of those. Okay, so what's going to change? So I think there are obviously three outcomes we might be interested in. We're interested in, is the internet going to change who gives? Is it going to change how much they give? Is it going to change who they give to? Right. So who gives? who gives? I didn't quite mean it like that. So is the internet going to change who is giving to charity? So I was interested in Beth's comments in her position paper about the internet isn't going to change sort of people's fundamental generosity, but it may well allow people to express that generosity. It may well bring into philanthropy people who otherwise wouldn't have given. And I think it might do this in two ways. First, by engaging new donors, people who otherwise wouldn't have given through traditional means, either because they weren't accessed or because that the internet appeals to them in a way that sort of more traditional methods didn't. And also, the internet may reduce the cost of giving or reduce the cost to organisations of reaching potential givers. So it may be that the internet may change who gives. What about how much people give? So there are a lot of examples we've heard about of how people have given through sort of online forms. So clearly, people are now giving online, but to really understand whether the internet is changing how much people give, we want to know a little bit about whether this is kind of additional giving or simply kind of complementary or substitute giving. So we want to know whether the internet is crowding out traditional forms of donations, whether it's leaving it unchanged, or whether it's actually crowding in other forms of donations by kind of bringing people into philanthropy. So I think that's the kind of really key issue to understanding whether the internet is going to change how much people give. And then finally, who people give to. And I think this is probably, of the three, the one where the internet is really likely to have the kind of the biggest effect. If I were to think about which organisations are likely to benefit from the internet and to kind of be internet winners, I think they're likely to be those that are innovative, and there's lots of examples of innovative organisations, although perhaps innovation gives you a short-run advantage, but obviously you keep having to innovate in order to keep benefiting in the internet age. But the sort of second and third characteristics of internet winners, which I'll talk a little more about, is I think the internet gives power to organisations who can demonstrate effectiveness and also organisations that are very distinctive. Does that mean you lost your bet? Or is that, no, that's a text.
Yeah.
Yeah. Taking myself out for a drink now.
Okay, so one possibility is that the internet will give more power to effective organisations. So with the internet, donors can search online to find out how their donations are spent. And in principle, this means that they might channel their donations to effective organisations. So internet winners are organisations who can demonstrate their effectiveness. But I think there's a lot of qualifiers to that statement. The internet fundamentally lowers the cost of information sharing and information acquisition, but it doesn't really change the cost of producing the high-quality information. High-quality information on performance outcomes is costly to produce. Once you've produced it, it's sort of cheap to acquire and share, but the information itself about how effective organisations are is quite costly to produce. So as we've seen, there may be a role for wealthy funding organisations and donors to kind of fund the creation of this information, but it's not a cheap activity, and there are also lots of issues about what information individuals will actually want to see and what information they'll actually want to act on. Another point about experience in other areas is that we know there's a sort of one Google, Amazon, eBay. So experience in other areas points to dominance by a limited number of aggregators. So while at the moment there's a sort of a growth in these online marketplaces, if we look at other areas, it suggests that over time there may be concentration on just a few, which I guess also relates to the fact that this information is still very costly to produce. So the third feature of possible internet winners is their distinctiveness. So I've modified this diagram from Lucy's paper. So, as I said, I think the internet gives power to distinctive organisations or niche organisations. So we've heard a lot about the long tail in terms of the internet empowering the kind of the long tail of the distribution. So in a couple of, I think in Lucy's paper, her long tail was actually individual donors as opposed to kind of wealthy donors and funds. But I think actually the long tail is in terms of the mission, can be expressed in terms of the mission of the organisation. So we think of kind of, mission is maybe the particular outcomes or the way in which those outcomes are delivered. And there are clearly mainstream organisations who are going to appeal to a large number of donors. And then these kind of niche organisations who will only appeal to a few organisations. So what the internet does is allow these niche organisations to find donors. So I would describe it as the internet can allow mission matching and can allow these niche organisations to more easily find the donors who will fund them. So I think the internet should, this is kind of all very theoretical, but you can imagine it will give more power to those niche organisations. Sorry, I've nearly finished. And then finally, there's the internet enhances the role of social networks in giving. So I think we're going to have more giving taking place in social contexts. There's been some research into how sort of social contexts affect giving in economics, which I think is really exciting and really interesting. So a lot of these are sort of basically randomized field experiments, so sort of treatment and control groups. And they've shown, for example, that people are more likely to give and give more if they're asked by people they know, rather than being approached by a stranger. People also give more if their giving is public, not private. This is a sort of really nice little study of church collections that randomised between bags and plates and found that the plates led to higher donations because that was more public. And then finally, we know that whether people give and how much they give is affected by social information. So if they're told about a higher proportion of people giving or giving more, then people themselves give more. So all this is suggesting that this social context, which is sort of fundamental to online or internet giving, is going to drive donations in the future. Not necessarily. So I should also point out that all these relate to donations to individual charities. What we don't know is then what happens to donations to other charities, and that's clearly a very important question. Okay, so to finish, as I said, this is the challenges and the opportunities. I don't think we know very much, sort of for sure, about the kind of the global picture of giving and about how the internet is impacting on that. So I think we do need to know a lot more. So I would say that because I'm an academic, and this is kind of my research agenda going forward. So I think we need to know a lot more about what affects people's decisions about giving, the sort of fundamental questions. I don't think we have sort of full answers to that. I think a really big question is how online giving affects offline giving, whether all this giving online is additional or whether it's just substituting for offline giving. I think we really want to know how does giving to one charity affect giving to another. We've heard a lot about there's a lot of evidence how individual charities have used the internet to increase their donations. But is that simply moving the money around, or is it actually creating kind of more giving? I think that's a really important question. However, I think the internet itself provides an excellent opportunity to learn more. There are lots of transactions data being generated, as Lucy said, and we're working with Just Giving to get all their data and explore this kind of social context around giving. And also there's lots of opportunity for online surveys and more of these kind of field experiments, which really do tell us kind of in quite concrete terms about the effects of different mechanisms on individuals' donations. Anyway, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to respond.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. We have a second response from Jenny Harrow, who's the co-director of the ESRC Centre for Charitable Giving and Philanthropy.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you also for the opportunity to respond to Lucy's paper. ESRC tells us we're in purdah for the election. So anything I say can be attributed entirely to Cass Business School, where I'm related. So it's always nice to be able to blame somebody else. And I think that's true in the e-philanthropy game as well. I was recently described in a group not unlike this, not as a discussant or a respondent, but as the despondent. And I then proceeded to make some extremely miserable remarks, which had people looking at their lunches for sort of trying to get out of the room, and lots of mobile phones ringing. So aim not to be despondent, aim really to pick up on the key issues that Lucy's paper is driving us forward on in relation to optimism, in relation to coherence, which I think is a major challenge for the sector, and in relation to recognition of this sense of movement, which I think it's actually ironic that for me, and my background is voluntary sector management, we're very used to using the term movement for ourselves. Our own organisations, housing, used once upon a time to call itself the housing movement. It does no longer. But that word is coming back, and in fact what is happening is that there is a different sort of movement going on, and it's the technology movement. We can cope with one and not with the other. I wanted to pick up on 3 areas which I think arise from Lucy's paper, and then perhaps pull those threads together rather more quickly. The interesting issue, of course, that she's raising throughout is the question of with whom are people engaging? And the evidence we've had this morning about activism, about people snowbound on K Street or whatever, are people on the ground, people on the spot, people with an active interest in change. It's striking, I think this may mean, of course, that we are weaning people off the idea that the e-philanthropy approach is entirely about fundraising. But of course the disruptive experience is also going on in e-commerce. The commercial firms whose job it is to support fundraising efforts are very much launching themselves, and have done so for a decade, as e-philanthropy means fundraising and friend raising, I think is one of the classic ones that many firms do. So who is being engaged with, and whether it's the conventional or the disruptive donor, still I think remains to be a question. When we think about disruption, perhaps we ought also to look at the disruptive impact this is having on the e-commerce end of the business, and whether it is the e-commerce end of fundraising that also needs to change and respond. I think the second issue that is very prominent from Lucy's paper is, of course, not just the speed, the flexibility, but the knowledge of what's happening in cases of disaster and major international crises. What this also does, of course, is demonstrate e-philanthropy's immense vulnerability. I think it was the day after January the 12th, and there was certainly warnings on Google from the FBI about who you should and shouldn't be donating to. A little bit later, and a bit more cautious from the Charity Commission, the same principle. The BBC in the UK has highlighted one so-called foundation whose website was using photographs from the tents from the Pakistan earthquake that had been put up several years before by SOS Children. E-philanthropy is vulnerable to fraud of not simply a disruptive scale, but fraud on a scale that will antagonize donors in, again, new ways. Lucy referred to the sort of historic problems of some of the major non-profits in the US, American Red Cross, there have been smaller equivalents here. But that antagonism would be nothing like the antagonism from internet donors and givers when vulnerability is exercised like that. I think the third issue that's interesting is if we recognise that fundraising as an issue is a critical area, not the only area, the question then is whether or not the e-philanthropy movement in both senses, uses and supports technology to open up the public spaces in which people, activists, beneficiaries, either directly or in that inverted commas use of beneficiaries, are having their say. There is a growing academic literature which is suggesting that where non-profits are using e-philanthropy in these ways, that is to not exactly encourage the e-democracy element, but to give beneficiaries their say, to give recipients as well as givers direct expressions of their experiences. This has had to mean, and I'm looking at Laurie Brainard's work here, this has had to mean that the organisations have had to, as she calls it, tone down their charitable style donor demands. They are actually having to be very careful about how they're asking for money, how they are presenting their beneficiaries, how their beneficiaries appear in the videos that they choose to stream. If you start to look at e-philanthropy from the view of opening up public spaces, the e-democracy arguments, then this also changes the relationship. And I think these long-term relationship changes are going to be quite striking. Laurie Brainard talks about the non-profit spirit in taking lessons for the internet. And the non-profit spirit may indeed be rather more to this older concept of social movement than the concept of movement in the technological sense. I was very struck by Lucy's paper not just because of its transforming nature, but because of the sense of moving forward for some organisations, but the transforming impact that it's having on other organisations who are then learning from each other across internet boundaries. Now, if you're in that cutting-edge literature of the transforming group, then you know it's going to be disruptive and you can live with that. If, like me, when it comes to innovation, you're in the laggards of that four-box matrix, you're the one that waits to see what everybody else has done before you make the move, then there is still the question, I think, for many third sector organisations, which is how to translate the messages of e-philanthropy into their work. Some of them will, and indeed have already, transformed, but many of them will still be looking for the translations. Many of them are still, we know, in that formalised sense, and how you translate what can be learned without, in a sense, changing everything is going to be demanding. In the coffee, caffeine, thank God, but no pizza, which is a bit of a shame, really. Beforehand, was talking with colleagues about organisations that, in fact, might go down this route, but actually think too much. So as well as transforming organisations and e-philanthropy and needing to translate e-philanthropy, there are those organisations that are going to be transfixed by it. There are going to be those who are going to be caught in the headlights of the demands of the sorts of hugely impact-led developments that Lucy was talking about. And it is those organisations with my hat on, of third sector management, that also, it's not only they don't need to be left behind, but I think the recognition of being transfixed by this type of change is a huge challenge. And it's a challenge for, ironically, quite conventional foundations and funders who may be the route out to break open this sense of organisations that are transfixed. Not because they don't know what to do, because in fact they are thinking too deeply about it. It is, I think, possible. Because if you get academics on your boards, then you are in dead trouble, because that's where you're going. I think my final points of comments in relation to Lucy's paper, the issues of new governance systems that this is promoting and this is developing, are challenging, of course, about the new entrants into philanthropy, the people who may be there for a short while, the people who may be themselves quite disruptive as they move on and change relationships. But it struck me as I was looking at the presentation and also listening to Dame Stephanie, who was talking about evangelism around e-philanthropy. And when Lucy was talking about ecosystems, that in fact perhaps what we're doing is we're putting the E in the wrong place. And maybe we should be talking about ecosystems. And if we're talking about ecosystems for the organisations who have grasped e-philanthropy, then we also need to have an ecosystem for the organisations that are either transfixed by it and unable to join in, and for the organisations who are still looking to it to translate what they do and where they do it. Thank you.
Jenny, thank you very much indeed. We haven't got a lot of time, but Lucy has said she'll take questions from the floor, so here's your opportunity.
Do you want the other two respondents up?
I think there isn't time. Okay.
I'll take the mic. Could I just say, if you ask a question, I'll give you the mic so that we can hear the question on the
Here we are.
broadcast.
Beth Breeze from the University of Kent. I was waiting to see if there was a more clever question, because I have a very simplistic question, which is just about your use of the word disrupting. Now, to me, disruptive is sort of naughty child in the class or errant employee, you know, not a good thing. But actually, you have a very upbeat and optimistic analysis of how technology can transform or change philanthropy. And I just wondered, is there any particular reason you use that word, or am I just reading too much into it?
You may be reading too much into it, but actually I'm stealing from Clayton Christensen's work on disruptive innovation and what he's tracked in the way business organizations have been changing. I was talking at the coffee earlier too. I mean, these are forces over which no individual enterprise really has control, other than to close the door and hope they don't come home to roost, or embrace them, or somewhere along that spectrum. And for established organizations with existing infrastructures, boards, governance procedures, this kind of change is really difficult. It's much, much harder than to create something wholly new. And so if you're interested, Clayton Christensen's work on disruptive innovation, there's several books on it now, but it's both defining the kind of innovation he's talking about, and then it has wonderful resources for established organizations, how to structure themselves to actually be able to engage this kind of change.
Thank you, Lucy. Yes?
Hey, I'm David Rasmus. Thanks for that, it was great. Question more about probably leadership than philanthropy. When you mentioned about the librarian, it was really interesting. It's a thought I've often had about how, as the power shift has changed, as information has become more readily available, where the academics and leaders used to control that and be able to distribute it as lecturing to a group. You know, you said the librarians have dealt with it quite well, where we thought maybe libraries would be dead, but they're not, they're thriving. Do you see librarians and other leaders a change in the role of that leader that's common amongst, you know, maybe pastors, teachers, whatever they are, or maybe even just with librarians? Just, I'm interested to know your thoughts about how the role might be changing for those that had the power before.
We have a representative of one of the greatest libraries here from Bodley, and I don't know if you'd like to come in as well.
I think their respect for new knowledge and discovery will drive them as leaders. We have here in Oxford wonderful leadership of Sarah Thomas, who has come from Cornell, who is Bodley's librarian. And within the Bodleian itself, Sarah and her colleague Richard Ovenden are world leaders in what's called the Future Arch project, in terms of advising people how to use technology and electronic materials into new archiving ways. And so it is, I think there are demonstrated leaders in the field, and hopefully there will be media light cast upon those wonderful librarians that do that sort of thing.
Do you want to bring those two together, Lucy?
Well, I mean, I think the leadership is absolutely critical, because leading from without is a fundamentally different thing than being at the top of an organizational structure, driving decisions down through existing hierarchical approaches. I mean, it takes a whole different fundamental set of assumptions about where the expertise and the energy that you need to harness to achieve your mission, where that lives. And I think, so I don't have other examples for you of whole-scale industries where this is happening well, although I might give me your email and I'll think about it for a while. But they're definitely that, you know, individual leaders in various places that have mastered these skills. In some ways, it's community organizing at a vast scale. You know, I thought your comments about are we back to movements is a very interesting one, because there's a lot that can be carried forward there.
Right, one last question before we break up. Over there, please.
Hi, this is a question in process. My name is Roberto Distasio, and I work with Dame Stephanie on the Ambassador Program. And there's just so many different ideas, and so I'm going to try and talk it through. You talk about social enterprise,
Yes.
which, especially in this country, I don't believe we have a definition for yet, okay, at least in the UK. In the States, it's beginning to form, but it's not really there, and we have this and that. Okay, but you spend some time on that. You also spent a lot of time on developing these ideas of these organizations that get built from nothing, you know, that just come out of the woodwork to solve a problem, et cetera, that may develop intellectual property. You know, I mean, here we are, a bunch of, you know, really cool people, you know, sitting around developing this thing together, and we've made this thing, and we form it somehow, and yet we don't know what it is. We don't know if it has real capitalistic value. And then we form this thing, and it's a nonprofit, or it's a social enterprise. It doesn't allow for flexibility in terms of funding, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm seeing here is this tug of war of socialistic notions of like working in a commonality and working as a group, but yet innocent in a way, that they don't really understand the capitalistic markets, which are very open to great ideas in terms of funding. I mean, and the wealth creation that is there, which does not necessarily come in a social venture, because it's not owned. It's owned by us all in some way. I mean, it's different definitions in each country. So I guess my question is, what do you think about what I just said? You know, because I think this is really, it's both the future, and yet, because we had program-related investments. Remember those? Never taken up. They've existed for the longest time, and that was where foundations in the States could invest in nonprofits or even for-profit companies that had a social outcome. And yet they were never taken up.
Well, that's a different question.
I know.
Okay. That's another door. But that actually is what the L3C is designed for, although another conversation about whether that's the wrong solution to a rightly identified problem. I actually, in this conversation, as a reflection literally of my thinking right up to last night, was trying to align the movements in social enterprise and technology in their most positive light, so that I wouldn't be a despondent to my own talk. But there is actually very much, because of the power of technology to lower cost, the zeitgeist of open source, the recognition by nonprofits and social enterprises finally that they operate in a marketplace, and the rapidly changing, hotly debated issues around intellectual property. These are just as easily arrayed on a playing board as nothing but, you know, absolutely counter prevailing forces. And I think we don't know the answer, which is partly why that policy project, I believe, is so important, because we can't begin to think through those answers systemically until we can get representatives of the vested interests to understand that they should care about net neutrality, or that intellectual property matters to the way they do their work, or really understand what it means to use a Creative Commons licensing scheme. And what we're seeing, and this is how humans work, we always see this, little steps, they start to snowball, they get some traction, but nobody's looked at the path over here in light of the path over here.
Right, but having been hijacked by my own chief of staff, we'll have a last question, please, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy, and thank you to the respondents. I think we need to remember that philanthropy, giving in general, is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And I think 20 years ago in the UK, if you wanted to make a difference as an individual, you would automatically give to a charity. That was pretty much all there was. Now charities are just one of many players in this space. And I think what's interesting is that more and more people, still a minority, but more and more people want to give to solutions, want to be feel as if they are part of the solution. And the huge challenge for traditional charities in the UK, I think, is that I think I think people are increasingly cynical of the bigger charities launching huge fundraising campaigns on the back of top-down campaigns that people might feel are really to sustain that charity as an institution, rather than the ability to contribute directly to finding solutions to problems. So it's not really a question, sorry. It's kind of a statement.
It's generally for philanthropy.
But I work a lot with the bigger UK charities, and that is, you know, it's not helped by the fact that professionalisation of the different careers within big charities, which is, I guess on the face of it, a positive thing, has meant that the walls between silos have in many cases become thicker, and that fundraisers, for example, are quite often a long way removed from the programme delivery people. I wish that perhaps they could all be sitting around the same table.
Very strategic one to finish on.
Well, there's, I think Steve puts his finger on a very important issue, and again, it's a place of where many organizations are getting stuck, and there are also some examples of organizations that are very successfully have built an have focused on a mission over a decade or so, have focused on a mission over a decade or so, have built their organization, and are now recognizing that the best way to achieve their mission is to actually do everything they can to hand it out. So I'll give you two examples which you can search for on the internet that are interesting stories. One is Kaboom, which is helps build playgrounds in the States. K-A-B-O-O-M exclamation point, Kaboom. And they've now they've incited the building of more playgrounds outside of anything that they actually do than they themselves have built. The other one that's very interesting is the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research, which is all about aggregating dollars for medical disease research. But one of they're accidental. At first they didn't want it. They tell a great story of actually trying to close the door on these local fundraisers for several years until they finally realized that simply allowing people all over the world to align their local commitment to that mission with the Michael J. Fox Foundation's imprimatur built a network of organizations working on their behalf that they could manage and actually raise. I think they raised $7 million this way with half a staff person at the central office who really did nothing other than make sure that they got the logo when they needed it, because the work was happening in the crowds. So there is a way to do both. It's not easy, but there is a way to do both.
Thank you very much. I don't seem to have done my job because I was supposed to finish off at 12 o'clock. We're running late. My apologies, Bill. But
I'll take responsibility.
A big thank you, Lucy, for a stimulating lecture and indeed for the discussion. Thank you to the two respondents. I'm sorry that there wasn't enough time, but I think people will stay around to explore some of those ideas. Thank you all for coming. And those of you who are joining us this afternoon again, I hope we can build on the things that we've started today. Thank you very much indeed.